Good morning, everyone. This is Sunny Lee Williams. I am here this morning to give an overview of our housekeeping items, and then we'll jump right into Supporting Language Limited English Proficiency, our 8th and final webinar for this technical assistance year. We are here today to come together on the cultural linguistic competency and health disparities, where the vision, persons of all cultures and ethnicities partnering with local and state systems to achieve equity in access, services, interventions, and outcomes in our systems. The mission overall of the Cultural Linguistic Competency and Health Disparities Committee is to facilitate cultural and linguistic competency strategies throughout Indiana state and local systems to improve outcomes for populations vulnerable to disparities and disproportionalities. This specific committee oversees the Cultural Linguistic Competency Project, of which since 1996, the Cultural Competency Enhancement Project has been to provide training services and technical assistance for our community mental health centers and addiction providers throughout Indiana. Training services are designed to improve organizational effectiveness and efficiency in providing culturally competent services. We're going to go ahead and move straight into Supporting Language Limited English Proficiency Policy. I always like to give a background on speakers and really understand their credibility and background experience. And I liked it to do limited English proficiency because I have a deep passion for folks that have English as a second language. I myself was born overseas in Taipei, Taiwan. English is not my first language, Mandarin Chinese is. And I've had some just fascinating experiences over the course of my both education and higher ed and adult life pertaining to language and language impact. I am a limited English proficiency expert when it comes to business interpretation from American English to Chinese. English is my second language, and I had the incredible experience of going through and passing the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services test, which does include an in-person interview on national language proficiency and is part of the naturalization process for U.S. citizenship. I've often noted how I wish that everyone had the experience of actually taking the U.S. citizenship test, because it's a tremendous experience, and it's a tremendous history of the U.S. American history, and also a great way to just really be proud of going through that experience and becoming a citizen of the United States. I have in the past been a U.S. citizenship test tutor, and still continue to be a tutor for the test of English as a foreign language, which is the TOEFL exam. TOEFL is most well known for as an examination for students coming to the United States to either study here, do work visas, or continuing education. But TOEFL is actually also utilized in many different federal U.S. departments and local and state examinations when it comes to English proficiency in support of interpretation and support of overall proficiency in the English language for graduate and furthering continuing education as well. So I'm very excited today to participate in presenting limited English proficiency and sharing with you what the limited English proficiency policies, plans, procedures, and overall technical implementation of how that can impact your organization. So without further ado, let's take a look at the webinar objectives for today. What are we here to do today? We are to understand the importance of limited English proficiency, support and implementation guidelines. And why do we want to do that? We want to do that because LEP is actually a charge required by the federal government to all of the organizations that are on the webinar today. We want to account for how to implement that LEP plan, policies, and procedures in your organization to ensure that there's non-discrimination. And how do we do that? How do we ensure that that implementation accounts for non-discrimination? We're going to look at very tactical steps of how to review, update, and implement your organization's plan, policy, and procedures to first better those operations and then have the impact of ensuring non-discrimination. So why do we talk about LEP? We've focused LEP across the board on multiple different areas, limited English proficiency, but specifically, why are we talking about this in cultural competency and in context of mental health and addictions providers? Well, in a previous webinar around healthy people and social determinants of health, we talked about leading health indicators and the 12 topics that are represented visually in front of you today. These leading health indicators actually all have and can be impacted by limited English proficiency. So as we take a breakdown of these topics, access to health services, clinical preventative services, and oral health, that's the very initial engagement of patient and clients in making sure that they have bettering and sustaining health. But if language is a barrier, then accesses to services and the ability to even logistically understand how to get to services physically, what services, given that the American medical segmentation and categorization is very complex, how to actually go to those services, what services are being provided, that is all vocabulary that is difficult to navigate for our English-speaking citizens, let alone our individuals that are requiring additional language support. If we don't know how to access to health services, then we don't know how to account for preventative services and oral health, for both preventative services and oral health. So this is about, first and foremost, sustaining and accounting for health overall, in being able to understand how the U.S. healthcare system is structured and how to use it. Then why further limited English proficiency and its impact in health indicators? We look at mental health and substance abuse and misuse as well. If we go through and look at the impact of not understanding and having a language barrier, that causes significant and consistent stress and anxiety, and could then promote additional symptomologies that would lead to aggravated mental health concerns or even consideration of substance use. In that impact, that's of course a very severe result of a limited English proficiency, not being able to be afforded those services, but ultimately it accounts for an understanding of being able to have access to healthcare, have support on understanding diagnoses, treatments, and the general state of health for the individual. As we expand that, we look at, of course, the impact of maternal, infant, and child health and reproductive and sexual health. Imagine an individual that has limited English proficiency not only being stressed and frustrated with not being able to take care of their own health, but now expand it and compound it with that individual needing to take care of his or her children and family members and not being able to account for that. When we look at language proficiency, we're also looking at the social determinants of that and corresponding to all the social determinants that we look at when we understand housing, accessibility, transportation, and even education. And of course, the most impactful piece will certainly be when there is a significant incident, either involving injury and violence, and how individual persons with limited English proficiency or limited English ability are then able to actually explain what has occurred or provide claims, conflicts, and or a reporting of injury and violence occurring in the home or in their environment. So we talk about limited English proficiency not only because it's a regulation, but because it impacts the leading health indicators when we look at the access to health services through the ability to engage and converse about injury and violence, and of course, pertaining to that, the pain management of the overall impacts of our language on our healthcare. So as we look at limited English proficiency, do keep in mind that as we are going through each of the policies, plans, et cetera, that it is a very interactive and individualized one-on-one to be able to account for the actual interpretation of what the individual needs to share on just simply a language and interaction basis, and then what the individual is sharing based upon an actual medical need terminology basis. Let's get into the regulation piece now and begin with who needs to comply with limited English proficiency. The limited English proficiency is applicable to all federal government, all agencies, programs, and operations of the federal government, state agencies, local agencies, private and nonprofit entities, and anyone that is subrecipient, the receiving funding from any of the entities listed above. That's a significant breadth of agencies and organizations that must comply with limited English proficiency. There are additional impacts of federal funding for recipients, and when you look at it from a compliance with limited English proficiency, it may not be a direct funding from federal, state, or local. It might be funding from foundation, it might be funding from endowments, etc. But as long as there is any mix of funding from any of the sources applied here, limited English proficiency is required for organizations providing those programs. So let's take a little bit of an overview of what is limited English proficiency specifically. LEP is a federal regulation, and we're going to cover the federal regulation details in a significant amount of detail. And then we're going to look at as well that LEP is a non-discrimination plan, policy, and procedure. We're going to review LEP implementation plans as guided by the Department of Justice. We're going to take a look at policy directives and procedures as well and give samples so that organizations that do not yet have LEP implemented, but should, can follow a very simplistic prescriptive procedure. And those that have LEP plans in place can look at review and improvement and continuous updates of those plans. And then finally, as we mentioned with LEP and its context to health indicators, LEP really should be considered as a responsibility of organizations to deliver services for clients and patients to better understand not only their own health, but healthcare in general, so that can be an impact to that individual's health. Let's jump straight in now to federal regulation. So, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 actually created the construct of non-discrimination under programs receiving federal assistance. So what this particular act did was that discrimination is prohibited. No person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be otherwise subjected to discrimination under any program to which this part applies. And this part is specific to Part 80, of which programming is defined as programs that are receiving funding and specifically enforced and managed through the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, that has been expanded across all federal governments, and that specifically identifies providing any service, financial aid, or other benefit to an individual which is different or is provided in a different manner from that provided to others under the program. In short, this sentence is specifically identifying equity and stating if you have a program that is being created and crafted for the composite majority, you also must make the appropriate considerations and implementation for the minority as well. In this case, the minority that we're discussing as we're defining is those persons with limited English proficiency. And then in furtherance to that, even if there's absence of prior discrimination, a recipient being defined as the organization providing the program, may take affirmative action to overcome the effects of conditions which resulted in limiting participation by persons of particular race, color, or national origin. And what this is saying from a federal regulation perspective is even if the organization has not previously discriminated or is not currently actively discriminating, they still must ensure that there are protections against future discrimination. So how do we account for a regulation passed in 1964 to an actual implementation? Well, federal regulations did update from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into a specific executive order passed more recently in August of 2000, which specifically looked at the implementation of how to improve access to services for persons with limited English proficiency. And in that regulation, there are 3 specific areas that were improved upon even in federal law. The first part was it requires federal agencies to examine the services they provide, a self-examination of services and programming to ensure that if there is even unacknowledged discrimination, that those services and that review be identified so that those potential discriminations could be resolved. Identifying a need for services to those with limited English proficiency, so accounting for specifically that LEP learners, individuals, have the services afforded to them to ensure that there is equity in the presentation of services and programs, and then in the actual execution of those services and programs. And then finally, developing and implementing a system to provide those services so LEP persons can have meaningful access to them. And here when we say system, we're talking about a plan, policy, and procedure to ensure that there is continuous review and continuous updating to account for new persons with limited English proficiency coming into our service, and also new needs when it comes to the understanding of treatment and diagnosis. This particular executive order accounted for an expectation that agency plans will provide for meaningful access and be consistent with the fundamental mission of the agency, which specifically means that there is an opportunity to expand the services and allowance of what the agency is providing for, and that it is also giving a guideline for exactly how far to take services and support for English proficiency. We'll cover that in a little bit. The executive order also ensures that federal agencies have to work to ensure that recipients of federal financial assistance provide meaningful access to the LEP applicants and beneficiaries. For organizations that are familiar in participating on federal grants, there is a significant clause in the contracting with each department of federal agencies regarding the impact of limited English proficiency, translation of documents, and availability of interpretation and services. And then finally, to assist federal agencies in carrying out these responsibilities, the U.S. Department of Justice has issued a policy guidance document, Enforcement of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, National Origin Discrimination Against Persons with Limited English Proficiency. This specific enforcement and policy guidance document is included within the resources of today's webinar. I further want to point out how initial federal regulation that started out under the Civil Rights Act to be enforced by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services back in 1964, in the update to 2000 was moved to the Department of Justice to account for enforcement. That's a significant impact in enforceable agencies and the actual guidance, regulations, and the filing and treatment of complaints when it comes to this increased focus on limited English proficiency. Let's now, following the regulations, take a look at what does this policy guidance really mean, and what does a language access implementation plan truly need to deliver. In the next slide, I'll go through language access implementation plan, and specifically how to write a plan, the plan in place, how to write the subsequent policies, and also the subsequent procedures. All right, moving on to the next slide. Language Access Implementation Plan. The plan purpose is that it is a management document that seeks to outline how the agency, or in this case, your organization, has or will define language assistance tasks, set deadlines and priorities, assign responsibilities, and allocate the resources necessary to come into or maintain compliance with language access requirements. This is ultimately a written document led by management, enforced by management, and trained to all parties that specifically looks at service delivery standards, policy directives, and addressing language service and resource needs that are identified. I encourage you to go back to your organizations and ask about a language access implementation plan, or simply how the organization plans to provide limited English proficiency. The actual title of the plan might not be language access implementation. It might be something along the lines of limited English proficiency plan. It might be something along the lines of English learner support plan, any variation of that. But do ask your organizations to see if that such plan exists and if it's in place. That directly correlates into why we have these technical assistance webinars, to ensure that federal and also state regulations that we should be aware of but maybe have not had the opportunity to be trained on are provided, so that we can, as change agents and individuals that have participated and are educated on the information on the webinar, can bring that back as a recommendation to your organization. All right, let's take a look specifically now at the plan components. So the implementation plan has specific plan components as instructed by the Department of Justice. These 4 components, as listed here, are periodic review of limited English proficiency needs by doing an inventory of languages most frequently encountered. Now, that's going to be really a quantitative assessment that needs to be done inside of your organization. If you're a mental health and addiction provider today, and you are still conducting walk-in services and or in-person appointments, that very specifically could be a survey that is done through a direct question by your counselors or treatment providers on an inventory of languages that are required or needed by clientele. If you are not currently doing in-person and you're utilizing telehealth because of COVID-19, that same question can be asked as a survey on the telehealth interaction. Also under periodic review, there is a need to identify primary channels of contact with LEP community members. How are we actually engaging with our LEP members? Are we doing visits in person? Are we having interactions over the phone? Is there email or hard mail being provided? Do we have communications via websites? And are those websites appropriately being provided in the languages of most encounter? Then we need to account for reviewing agency programs and activities for language accessibility. Again, in the context of mental health and addictions providers, when we're doing group support or group therapies or family support therapies, are we accounting for additional languages that might be more comfortable or even more more competency can be provided within that support group? So looking at that from a perspective of, in a support group environment, are we accounting for the different languages that are represented? And are we conducting the materials and the programming in a way that seeks to have best competency and understanding by the individuals going through services, treatment, and or direct familial interaction. Then as we look at periodic review of LEP needs, we need to look at where our written policy directives are. Do we have standards, operating principles, and guidelines, and are they made publicly available? Do we have written procedures for how-to for staff with steps on how to provide language services, gather data, and deliver services to LEP individuals? And then do we have roles and responsibilities identified? Do we have a designated primary contact person for LEP services? The next two slides are going to be very specific verbiage that is an actual Office of Civil Rights Limited English Proficiency recommended policy. So for those that responded that you do not have an implementation plan in place today, this begins from the slide deck perspective, the actual verbiage that you can copy and paste to account for putting in a preliminary policy, which will then drive you towards creating a plan. So this policy begins with an overview of a commitment by your organization that the organization will take reasonable steps to ensure that persons with limited English proficiency have meaningful access and an equal opportunity to participate in the services that you provide, activities, programs, and other benefits. The policy then accounts for a listing of vital documents, waivers of rights, consent to treatment forms, financial insurance benefit forms. We'll cover all of those forms in detail in subsequent slides. I want to just give you the full verbiage of the policy to get a better understanding of what deploying an LEP policy and plan in the organization would include. Then the policy also discusses and accounts for a public commitment that the organization will provide language assistance to be provided through the use of competent bilingual staff interpreters, contractors or formal arrangements with local organizations, and or technology and telephonic interpretation services. This policy does not intend that you have all four types of language assistance being provided. We'll talk about analysis of what is the most important and appropriate types of services in subsequent slides, in discussion of first understanding the data of who is coming into your organization and having encounters, and how you then create a service plan around that to ensure that those individuals are being supported in their native language if they have limited English proficiency concerns. Okay, and then it's to a commitment to ensure that you are conducting a regular review of the language access needs throughout the patient population and updating and monitoring that policy and procedures as necessary. So that is the recommended policy. If you literally take and copy and paste this and input the name of your facility and include all of the documents, in this first part, there will be additional documents that you'll need to include. And in the second part on language assistance, you'll need to do some analysis to determine what is the most appropriate language assistance service to be provided. Now we're going to move from policy to procedure. And the procedure is a 5-point procedure that covers specifically how to do the things identified in the policy. So in the first slide on recommended procedure, first we need to identify LEP persons and their language. And again, this procedure is intended to be a copy and paste. This is taken directly from the Office of Civil Rights recommended documents of how you can create your own organization policy and procedural in efforts of creating that initial plan. So first off, identifying LEP persons and their language. Your organization will promptly identify the language and communication needs of the LEP person. And really, today, I'm going to give you some very tactical implementation steps of how to determine that for your counties, and actually look at that not from just an LEP person, but LEP persons, plural, and the languages that are represented in the counties that you serve. If necessary, staff will use language identification card or IC cards available. And again, those are resources, and we'll take a look at those in the tactical implementation portion. And in addition, records are kept of past interactions with patients or family members based upon the language used to communicate. We do want to look at procedures as well of obtaining a qualified interpreter, maintaining an accurate and current list showing the name, language, phone number, and hours of availability for bilingual staff. So that's if you're hiring staff internally. Contacting the appropriate bilingual staff member to interpret, and in the event an interpreter is needed, an employee who speaks the needed language or a contractor to help support that. That accounts for item C here. And then, of course, also identifying agencies that provide qualified interpreter services. I'm not recommending any services as part of the procedure, but I do have state-recommended QPA contracted organizations that we'll discuss about in the tactical implementation portion. And then specifically on the procedure, a commitment and an understanding of the organization that we do offer interpretation as an organization complying with LEP policy, that the actual interpretation is not to be charged to the patient or client, and that we will not utilize children or other clients, patients, or residents as the interpreter. Right? And then the last items on the recommended procedure, providing written translations, ensuring that when translation of vital documents is needed, that we account for the mission of those documents to be translated by either an identified staff person or, again, an external organization to provide that support. And ensuring that staff members know if that is an internal person, who that person is, and how that correlates with their scope of work, turnaround time, and languages available. And if that's contracted to outside, the same as well for contracted parties. And then providing notice to LEP persons, the language here specifically, to ensure that notices and signs and documents are available and posted wherever clients, patients, and residents congregate. And then also ensuring that communication and outreach is being provided appropriately through the use of telephonic, email versus hard mail, et cetera, means as well. And then ultimately from a procedural side, ensuring that as we assess changes in demographics, types of services, or other needs, that we're continuing to monitor and review, improve upon the implementation. So as we looked at those two policies and procedure areas in those last three slides, those are literally, again, a copy and paste option for you to take in and either create a new implementation plan or ensure that your existing implementation plan has these provisions from a policy and procedure perspective. So as we get into a review of how we do the implementation, I want to start that off specifically with the extent of agency obligations. So what is the actual analysis of whether or not our organization today must meet limited English proficiency policy? The first thing that we look at is it is truly a case-by-case basis as each individual patient, client, or resident comes to us and addresses and self-identifies whether there is a need. But it's not enough just to wait and see. We must also look at the environment and account for that through a four-factor analysis. Those 4 points of the four-factor analysis are the number or proportion of LEP persons served or encountered in the eligible service population, the frequency with which LEP individuals come in contact with the program, the nature and importance of the program, activity, or service provided by, and the resources available to the agencies and costs. It is amongst these four interdependencies that we actually look at how to implement the limited English proficiency plan, policy, and procedure. And then the next slides, and for the duration of the today's webinar, we're going to now talk about how to actually physically implement these particular obligations. So moving on, the LEP plan, policy, and procedure implementation goes over 5 distinct areas. It's the same 5 areas we just looked at under procedure, but now what's different from what we looked at from a literal copy and paste of language, we are now looking at the implementation, the how-to of executing each of these 5 points. These 5 points are identifying LEP persons who need language assistance, identifying ways in which language assistance will be provided, the training of staff, providing notice to LEP persons, and monitoring and updating LEP policy. So first off, let's take a look at identifying LEP persons who need language assistance. This is first and foremost a call for data. So here I have some resources for you to take a look at in better understanding exactly what the environment around you, so in federal categorization, that's your state and also your county. And then we'll take a look at a discussion of also doing a count internally, and that's based upon your own organizational data of how many people you've actually already encountered that have specific language needs. So let's go up to the high level and look at the federal piece first. There's an excellent website devoted to limited English proficiency, and that is at lep.gov. lep.gov also provides for an excellent data mapping by state and also by county. I highly encourage you to access those links and look at the information. Generally, I would go through and review the actual sites with everyone. I'm going to go first to the conclusion data sets on the next slide. And pending and ensuring that we don't have any issues, so I would like attendees to give feedback if they're not able to see the websites that I'll pull up. I do want to also do a brief technical assistance of how to access that data. So hopefully that will go smoothly. Let's go through the data first, and then let's go through the actual website tool. So first off, on the lep.gov, there is a very nice mapping capability that showcases the percent of limited English proficiency individuals by county. So this is the 92 counties of Indiana broken down into a color-coded, looking at counties with less than 1% through counties with over 70%. In the state of Indiana, we don't have any counties that are over 20% LEP proficiency. Limited. We do not have any counties with more than 20% limited English proficiency by county. How is that percentage derived? It is accounting for total population as the denominator and the total number of identified limited English proficiency as the numerator to calculate that percentage. Now, how do we know and where is it reported for limited English proficiency? We have that information quite directly through our BMV processes. So the Indiana Department of Transportation actually has a very good site that provides the total composite of that information. So when you're looking at the implementation plan in identifying what is the LEP needs within the county, you're actually going to go to 3 different websites to pull this information together. The first site is the lep.gov map app that showcases the percent of LEP by county. In that same website, you will then go into another section that gives you the actual county breakdown. So I've pulled that information here as well. And you'll see LaGrange County, Indiana actually has the highest rank above 10% and under 20% of the county being limited English proficiency. Then followed by, and I've simply pulled the top percentages of the top counties that have at minimum more than 5% and above. So you can see those counties here. Then if you go to the Indiana Department of Transportation, you can see the breakdown of those actual languages. So in LaGrange County, Indiana, with only 34,000 individuals living within that county, we have almost 9.4% other West Germanic languages, and then German accounting for an additional specific 3%, totaling already over 12.7% for West Germanic and German languages. So as you look at that specific overview of this sequence of links will take you then directly to a conclusion of these three data sets so that you can plan for what your limited English proficiency implementation plan may consider in as far as number of languages, which languages, and also the sizing and scoping of a number of limited English proficiency individuals that would be served by your particular organization. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to exit the PowerPoint slide. I'm going to bring up the actual websites. So in your screen here, if the bandwidth has and access is appropriate, I'm going to actually navigate you through so you see exactly where to go to these links. And I'm doing this specifically in hopes that you will take quick and immediate action when looking at the English proficiency plan limited English proficiency plan for your organization. So at lep.gov, you'll navigate down to the data and language maps located here. Once you click on that, that will bring up your language map app. So all you have to do is navigate directly to the state. So when this pulls up, you just access Indiana, excuse me, and you'll see a breakdown by population. So here you'll see that Spanish is overwhelmingly the #1 language being spoken other than English within the state of Indiana. And then all of the additional areas here are the additional languages. We really want to account for an understanding of really what that feels like when we go from having our native language to having having to pause and slow down in understanding a secondary language and ensuring that we have the information that's being presented. So this is the first map, and then if you click to switch to table mode, you'll be able to see the total languages and by alphabetical order for the state of Indiana. Now, if you go back to the home page, it'll give you several selections for the different map applications. So I'm going to go to yet a second website. When you go into the data portion of the map app, all you have to do is come up here under step 1 and select our state, Indiana. Select your specific county, or if you would like, you can leave that blank and populate the grid, and just click populate grid data, and that will actually pull this up. And then you can sort by any of these column numbers. This is updated as of 2015. I do not, unfortunately, have any information on when further data will be inputted and delivered into the U.S. Department of Justice for this particular map. I was looking for and had contacted the U.S. Department of Justice on the limited English proficiency site, but had not yet received a response on when the specific data will be updated to be more current. But this is data up to 2015. And then if you navigate to the Indiana Department of Transportation, you can go through and specifically get, this is a report, so there's nothing to filter, etc. You'll specifically get a report from the from INDOT on LE persons by county. And so all of these links, so these direct links, you do not have to search for them, are directly parked in that resources slide. So you have access to them to complete your LEP plan implementation investigation on your environmental scan. Okay. So now as we move forward from the available data, we want to also look at the second portion of identifying LEP persons who need language assistance by actually identifying in person. So as individuals are walking in, to be able to give them a visual representation that, yes, we as an organization do care what you are most comfortable in your conversing about your healthcare. We need to be able to provide visual cues of that. So one visual language identification card, and language identification cards or I Speak cards are a very good way to engage an LEP person by specifically having that visual cue versus potentially reducing some awkward conversations of, is there another language that you speak? And because ultimately that requires some, could result in some of the asker's own bias. So having a language assistance card at the front door, the waiting area, and of course within intake is helpful because that's a cue and helps to have the individual directly initiate, oh yes, I speak this other language, where then by the secondary question from the organization, from the team would be, what language would that be, and how can I help with, what language is that, and how can I help with providing information in that language? And then the individual might say, yes, great, or they might say, no, English is fine. So there is a whole slew of different I Speak cards that are already created, that are already very visually impactful on the resource page here. I simply grabbed one visual cue that I thought was very all-encompassing of some of the most prevalent languages that we have here within the state. This one is actually pulled from a county health department in another state, but this is a good example of a visual cue for identifying language assistance needs. And then we'll go on to the second implementation component, identifying ways in which language assistance will be provided. So there are 3 recommendations by the federal guidance. And the first one is having direct foreign language communication by fluent bilingual staff, meaning that if you are a treatment provider, that you have staff on site that is both clinically certified or licensed to provide the treatment, and they are a staff member that is bilingual and fluent enough that they are conducting both the treatment and the discussion on diagnoses and or additional health education directly in the language, native language of the choice of the client, patient, or resident. Then we have 2 separate types of language assistance. One is interpretation, which is oral, and translation, which is written. And we're going to just directly delve into types of language assistance on the next slide. I did want to make a note here that the federal guidance does not recommend software translation apps. And one of the reasons, a key reason really, of why the federal guidance does not recommend software translation apps is that there is a concern with the accuracy of the software translation. So I'll give you an example using a very specific example within the Chinese language. So in the Chinese language, there's 4 accents. So if I say the word to you, ma, 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 and ma, those are actually 4 separate accents. And those 4 separate accents are very, very slight. For some, just hearing me, it might have sounded like I said the same 4 mas with no change. And so because it's so slight, there is a very tough distinction, or it's very difficult for software language applications to distinguish the difference between those 4 accented sounds. Well, if I translate, rather interpret those 4 sounds to you, those 4 words were mother, horse, numb, and scold. So if I utilize a software translation app out of context, you can see how very problematic it could be if we did not have the appropriate translation and also the cultural competency and the context that's needed for that specific interpretation. So software translation apps are not recommended by the federal guidance, and the 3 distinct areas are medically certified, licensed, fluent bilingual staff, interpretation, and translation. Now, as we look at the types of language assistance, oral language assistance equals interpretation. Interpretation is such that when a person is conducting oral language support in person, so there is an interpreter physically in the room with you and your patient, client, resident. There is a telephonic interpretation, or there is an internet or video interpretation. Written language assistance is translation. And that translation of what organizations should have in place for LEP are documents that must be provided by law. And I've got a great resource link of all of the existing documents covering from Homeland Security to USDA. USDA's translated documents are specific on nutrition, and also housing and other agencies that are have already provided translations for basic regulatory, policy-based, or enforcement-based documents. And the majority of those agencies have translated all of those documents into the top 17 most encountered languages within the U.S. today. Then, of course, specific to the processes of your organization, we need to be able to account for translation for consent and complaint forms, intake and application forms, written notices of rights, notices of denials, losses or decreases of benefits of services, notice of disciplinary action, and notices advising LEP individuals of free language assistance services. So those are distinctly the types of language assistance that are being asked for from federal policy to ensure that it's in place to support our individuals with limited English proficiency. Next, we'll move on to the training of staff. So as we look at staff training, we look at specifically the areas of identifying an LEP coordinator, identifying the need for direct hired bilingual staff, identifying contracted interpreter services. So those could be any number of interpreter services that your organization reviews and chooses to use. I've included here state interpretation contracts. So what that means is these are organizations that the state, through the Department of Administration, has contracted broadly for other state agencies to use. This does not mean that this is a contracting for all organizations to use, but my opinion is if the state is using such contracted organizations, then they are likely good services that your organization can then consider and contract with. So the in-person interpretative is an organization by the name Language Training Center. Telephonic interpretation services is by an organization called Proficiency. And the translation of written documents today, there is not a contract, but there is a listing of resources of those documents, just as the federal resources of translated documents is available. And then sign language is specifically through FSSA, Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services, and I've included the link here that includes all of the information in that link, and you can just go down the order of contracted organizations to access their eligibility, rates, and contact information. The training of staff also needs to account for a periodic review of all updated documents. That can be identifying a designated, dedicated LEP coordinator, or that could be identifying a person to own the role of LEP coordinator to ensure that those updated documents are reviewed and completed on an annual basis. And further in implementation, we'll talk through that a little bit more as well. So here, I'm going to share with you a case for certified medical interpretation. At the earlier in the discussion, we talked about direct bilingual staff that have medical certification. So these would be physicians, nurses, licensed clinical social workers, etc., that have their medical practice license, and they are individuals that are native speakers in the languages that are of most encounter. The likelihood of having directed staff, bilingual staff, to be able to provide both is really dependent upon the employment opportunities and the overall workforce skill sets within the particular counties that you serve. In lieu of not having hired bilingual staff, there's an opportunity to look at hiring staff that are specifically trained in medical interpretation, meaning these are not individuals that have a physician, nursing, or licensed clinical social work license, but they are individuals that are certified in medical interpretation. So they are individuals that have the capacity for the language that they are certified in. They also have an understanding of the vocabulary and the medical interpretation aspect of that vocabulary, and being able to directly interpret for licensed medical staff. So the case for certified medical interpretation is very interesting in that many states today do have a certified medical interpretation reimbursement, along with certified medical interpretation workforce roles specifically identified under either the state health department or the Health and Human Services branch of the state agencies. Indiana has not yet pursued a review of certified medical interpretation, but we're essentially looking at a understanding of what are the national trends, and that certified medical interpretation is gaining ground simply because it is validated interpretation, and it accounts for rigorous training, examination, and continuing education and professional development resources, i.e., a great workforce development tool in partnering on limited English proficiency advocacy by ensuring that we are directly employing and supporting those individuals to have not only the language understanding and interest, but also then the fortitude to go through the medical interpretation examination and ongoing career path that it affords. And then ultimately, it accounts for the safety for patients and clients when interpreting medical terminology and diagnosis. My example earlier of the accented differences between the four words, if I say ma and it means numb, that is a very pain management and consideration of, ma, which is a consideration of the pain context or certain appendages not functioning normally, that can be misconstrued significantly with scold or mother. Now, certainly horse would not be in the context of this interaction, but making sure that the interpretation of medical terminology, when already irrespective of language, the patient needs to have more defined, articulate responses to ensure that healthcare professionals are understanding of how to diagnose. We need to ensure that interpretation does not create an additional barrier, but rather provides very directed terminology, very directed, concise diagnosis information. So certified medical interpretation, just by a little bit of background, today there are only two national certifications. One is by the Certification Commission for Healthcare Interpreters. The second is the National Board for Certified Medical Interpreters. I've identified the National Board certification for medical interpreters here because it is more robust and it has more requirements than the Certification Commission. So the certification for medical interpreters is that you must be a minimum age of 18 years old, have a proof of a U.S. high school diploma or GED, successfully complete at least 40 hours of medical interpreting training, and then demonstrate both the oral proficiency in English and also linguistic proficiency in the primary language of the primary language for which you are seeking certification. The National Board certifies Spanish, Russian, Mandarin, Cantonese, Korean, and Vietnamese today. And I really encourage folks that have a passion for the 40-some plus folks that speak another language other than English today, to really kind of look at the certified medical interpretation piece and see if this is something of interest to you. I would encourage all organizations to consider what is the best skill set to account for when looking at limited English proficiency. Of course, not all organizations need to go to a degree of having their staff certified for medical interpretation. I think that would be really based upon the county-based data that was shown prior. Now, making a case for it certainly can be showcased in your own quantitative data on what is the number and frequency of limited English proficiency individuals. The certified medical interpretation is a big investment and also a significant workforce to support when you're looking at the amount of professional development and ongoing support. The case really needs to be made on a state level first on certifying the medical interpretation in order to account for achievable reimbursement and sustaining that workforce. And so that certainly is a conversation that needs to be had in the future and in context of where the state sits today in even considering such a reimbursement. And as we move forward then, providing notice to LEP persons as a tactical implementation, we want to look at having the language identification cards that we talked about earlier placed in the waiting area and also upon intake. We want to make sure that you have a hard copy by language of all initial intake forms and disclosures specific to your organization. I worked with a phenomenal nonprofit services organization that was both a primary care clinic and also a family services organization providing family support and youth transition services. And they had a 12 by 5 hugely built out mailbox, looked like a bunch of mailbox blocks, but it was 12 by 5, and they had all of the forms printed out, color-coded by language. And so they would have that and had a very, very good workflow process where they had the color-coded papers, they had the original copies laminated, and those original copies would then be, as part of the administrative staff, would go and make sure every day they had enough copies and printed the original copy and then put all of the copies into the mail slots so that another administrative individual, based upon need of the patient, client, resident coming in, they would just pick through. So language 1, 12 slots, language 2, 12 slots of all of their forms and disclosures. If your organization has a significant support to limited English proficiency individuals, I highly recommend the same visual, very tactile, and also administrative workflow process to your organization. And then finally, having a hard copy resource document ready for federally translated documents, and that link that I discussed earlier is located here. This is the review of all available federal multilingual resources. Please, please, please look at this link before you undertake a translation action. And then, of course, you must look at whether or not your client or patient has internet access, so that if you are directly directing them to this link, you need to make sure that they have access to review it. And if they don't, then you may take it upon your organization's procedure on whether or not it's permissible to print off that information for your client or patient. As we move into the monitoring and updating LEP policies, we want to ensure that the review of the LEP policy is actually integrated with the annual budgeting process. We want to make sure that the policy is not just reviewed as a policy siloed. It needs to be incorporated with the budgeting process, because as in migration and the trends of who with LEP is seeking services with their organization changes, so does the cost of supporting the prior 4 implementation items that we discussed. So given that, as we look at monitoring, updating LEP policy, we want to make sure that it is critically and also clearly looked at during the budgeting process to account for additional hiring, additional contracting of vendors to provide the service, copying and printing costs, and of course, training costs and supporting our staff overall. Check the language data maps annually. I've essentially constructed a direct instruction of which 3 links to go to and how to pull the overview of what your LEP changes have look like for your county. But do absolutely track your own quantitative internal study as well to see how many LEP persons have we supported. Are we asking the question upon intake of, is there another language besides English that you would prefer to receive your services and treatment in? And then paying attention to in-migration trends. So that means specifically, as a staff member to your organization, watching the local news and looking at, is there a new employer coming to town? When Infosys came into Marion County, that provided a huge opportunity for not only new job growth for local hires, but also brought with the location of the North American headquarters for Infosys a very large Indian contingency of leadership and management coming to reside within Indianapolis. When we look at in Northwest Indiana, when we look at the overall component manufacturers, RV manufacturers, and all of the automotive industry indirects and the particular employers that provide supply chain to those particular industries, you have a significant mix of Chinese, Japanese, East Asian management, languages, et cetera, coming in. And you also have a significant immigration of the workforce that is trained to execute the automotive work. We have a significant Turkish-Armenian refugee population within the state of Indiana, and a significant number of those individuals were trained through the Indiana Chamber of Commerce to account for supporting our advanced manufacturing and also our automotive industries. When we look at our Chin Burmese refugee populations as well, we look at employment across the board in resettling the refugee populations and then accounting for Chin Burmese support being needed by the employers themselves in being able to provide limited English proficiency policy. What environmental impacts are happening? Has there been any kind of natural disaster that has required federal assistance of housing relocation? and how does that impact the in-migration to counties with new populations and new language needs? Are there refugees or migrant workers that are participating within the county? And how do we account for and understand how recent policies have impacted these individuals? And then, of course, we have to look at, for monitoring updating LEP policy, the LEP coordinator training and accounting for training for all LEP coordinators in being connected with both federal and state resources for limited English proficiency. So give everyone a moment to go through that. And then I'm going to come back here to the slides while you're typing to go over the upcoming training. So the upcoming training is on specifically Spanish-speaking individuals with limited English proficiency. And it's an excellent data training on how USA.gov in Espanol utilizes the data to support the evolving needs of Spanish language users. It is a free Zoom call. It is Thursday, June 11th from 2 to 3 Eastern, and it will be hosted by the Multilingual Community of Practice and Digital.gov. And you can register there on the link. So if you have not done so yet, please do download the slides from the GoToWebinar, again, by navigating to the handout section, maximizing the handout sections by clicking on the right-facing arrow, and then clicking on specifically the document PowerPoint in there that is Webinar 8, Limited English Proficiency. And all of those links are live. When you open up the PowerPoint, you just click on those, and then that will take you directly to the registration page. If you are not available to attend on June 11th, please still register, because when the recording is available, with the registration information, digital.gov will directly send you the recorded the recording. Okay. And then finally, last but not least, we have our a consolidated tools and resources guidance here, covering the LEP website through to the specific links on the data mapping. Again, I highly encourage that you take a look at these links in sequence of the slides as they are presented for the implementation piece. And I highly recommend that you take a look at implementing this for your organizations if your organization does not have a plan. And then if your organization does have a plan, benchmarking it against these recommendations that can improve the plan and thereby improving the service and benefit to the patients, clients, and residences that you serve. All right, we are at 10 till noon Eastern. If there are any other questions, please feel free to type them in. I will stay on the webinar through to the end at noon. However, this concludes the presentation. If there are no other questions, then I thank you greatly for your time and attendance today, your excellent engagement. And I hope that if you have any other questions, or as you go through implementation of the program, that you can contact us directly in support of additional tools and resources or suggestions at info@techserve.io. That is, again, info@techserve.io, and I will also put that into the chat tool. I appreciate everybody's interest and time today, and thank you very much for all of your support.